So we're going to wait just a couple minutes until we get a few more members present. Pete, Crystal, Meg, me. We just need one more member before I'm comfortable to move forward.
And Chris, we also have some new members to the team from the MOA. I'm sure you're probably aware, Colby, Pickle, and sometimes Amy's on.
Yeah, Colby is in the queue or in the stack, so she's here. I don't know about Amy yet. Again, we're just waiting for one more member. Okay, so rather than waiting, what I'll do is I'll call the meeting to order, but Madam Clerk, we'll take the roll when we get one more person. So I am going to call this October 21st, 2021 meeting of the Enterprise and Utility Oversight Committee to order. And before we do the roll, as I suggest, we're going to begin the first presentation. Welcome, everybody. Item 3A is the Eklutna Hydroelectric Project Update from Chugach Electric Association. Julie or Lee, take it over.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to let Julie run with this. I think it's really exciting times. We went up to the site and watched the water go down the river, and I can tell you it was a pretty exciting event, and it was very exciting for one beaver. So it was good to see some progress made. I really want to thank the entire committee for everything they're doing. It really turned out well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Julie and she'll get into the details. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Lee.
Actually,
Chris,
Julie, hold on. Now I just want to roll back. Madam Clerk, would you do the roll?
Yes. Ms. Allard? Mr. Constant?
Here.
Mr. Dunbar?
Here.
Oh, that was Ms. Allard. And then Mr. Dunbar?
Here.
Ms. Kennedy?
Here.
Ms. LaFrance? Mr. Perez-Verdia? Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Ms. Quinn Davidson? Mr. Rivera?
Present.
Mr. Weddleton? And Ms. Zalatel?
Here.
You have a quorum.
All right, thank you. Ms. Haskett, you have the floor.
sorry, my microphone's playing with me here. Basically, Samantha Owen is going to give the presentation on the flow releases, but I just want to note that Lee is here, our CEO, and Brian Hickey, our COO. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Samantha because we think time is precious and we want to make sure we have adequate time for all your questions. So Samantha, go ahead.
Awesome, thanks, Julie. I'm going to share my screen. And if you could just let me know when you can see that.
I can see it. Can you see it, Chris and others?
Good to go.
Okay.
Perfect. So let's say slideshow from the beginning. All right. So on our agenda today, well, I think we already did introductions, but we're going to give you guys an update on what we've been doing since June. I think that's the last time we spoke with you. Specifically, we're going to go over the gate replacement that we did out at the dam, the public safety plan we implemented, The flow releases themselves, I think that's probably the thing most people want to hear about. The site visit that we did with AWU and the Native Village during the flow releases, and then some of the other field work we have going on right now and have had going on over the summer. And then we'll talk about our next steps and open it up for questions. So very briefly, before we get into that, I did just want to give people a reminder about both the requirements of the agreement and why we did these flows. We realized over the 3-week period that flows were in the river. We started getting a lot of questions about what that meant and and why we were doing them. So just for everyone's benefit, we wanted to go through this really quickly. The 1991 agreement requires the project owners to do basically 4 steps, right? First and foremost is study the impact of the hydro project on fish and wildlife, and then develop proposals for the protection, mitigation, and enhancement of fish and wildlife affected by that hydro development. Then consider the impact of fish and wildlife measures on electric ratepayers, municipal water utilities, recreational users, and adjacent land use, and evaluate ways to mitigate those impacts, right? So it's kind of a 4-step process. And the way we have set up our 2-year study program is that this first year, we really focused on numbers 1 and 2, looking at how the hydro project affected fish and wildlife and ways we could mitigate those impacts. And then this coming up year, we're going to really start to focus on numbers 3 and 4, which is kind of looking at all that other stuff, right? Impact to ratepayers, municipal water supply, recreation, adjacent land use, and we have other things like cultural and stuff like that thrown in there. And then looking at impacts to those resources and ways to mitigate or avoid those types of impacts. And so this year, we did some flow releases, as you know, and those flow releases were specifically for our in-stream flow study, our geomorphology and sediment transport study, and our water quality study to some degree. The in-stream flow study is trying to answer questions like, how much water would we need to put down the river for fish in order to create quality fish habitat downstream? The geomorphology study is trying to answer questions like, what would happen with all the accumulated sediment in the river when we put that water downstream? Both talking about the accumulated sediment behind the lower dam site, but also the natural sediment inputs in the upper river and all the embedded sediment that's kind of throughout the river as a whole. And then part of our water quality study this year was taking turbidity measurements of the water during our flow releases. So that's what these flow releases were for. They were really for study reasons to help us answer a lot of these questions and inform our future fish and wildlife program. And then, of course, that we'll have a proposal that we submit to the governor. The governor needs to make his decision by 2024. We start implementing in 2027, and then we have to wrap things up by 2032, as outlined by the agreement. So just high-level overview of the requirements in the 1991 agreement and why we're doing what we're doing. But okay, so the gate replacement. The last time we spoke to you guys, we, I think, had started to get rid of some of the rocks and debris that were in front of our drainage outlet gate at the base of the spillway. We originally sent divers down there, and we thought we were going to get all the rocks and debris out with the divers and be able to get a really good look at the gate. When the divers got down there in June, they realized, gee, there's a lot more rocks than we thought. So they got most of it out of the way, but not all of it. And therefore, we actually had to finish our rock and debris removal as part of the gate replacement itself. So here you can see we're placing, most people call these super sacks. They're basically giant bags of stuff that we piled up in front of the spillway to hold back water. And then we drained that area in between the spillway walls. The picture on the right is that area is being partially drained at that point, and you can start to see all the rocks that were sitting right there in front of the gate. Once we got that drained and once we removed all the rocks, we took out the old gate, which is there on the left. You can see it was pretty rusted and not in the best shape. And then we put in a pretty new gate, which you can see on the right. So this gate is looks exactly the same as the old gate, has the same dimensions, 30 inches by 30 inches. The only thing we changed was the actual material of the gate. So the old gate was cast iron, this new gate is stainless steel, and that will hopefully help the gate, or it did help the gate function better and under partially open, partially closed conditions, things like that. So we now have a fully functioning gate in the spillway, and that was completed in late August, early September timeframe. All right, so also about that time, we developed a public safety plan. So we had heard from various people, I think including yourselves, about some public safety concerns with putting flows down the river that would, greatly increase the normal flow in the river that might cause some public safety concerns. So we developed a public safety plan in coordination with the Native Village, the State Park, Eklutna Inc., and AWU. We touched base with the railroad and DOT and all of our downstream landowners essentially. And for the most part, the public safety plan included a lot of signage. We basically went to every access point we could find along the river, even though they're not official public access points. We do know that people use them, and so we put up some signage saying, danger, hazardous conditions due to high flows. We also put some signs in the pond upstream of the dam that said, hazardous conditions due to undercurrents, no swimming. A few people laughed at that sign, but someone will do it. So the other components of our public safety plan included notifications to people. So we sent out a notification to basically all of our stakeholders, informing them of the flow release schedule. We also sent out a more formal notification to all the downstream landowners. We know that the Native Village of Eklutna worked with us to develop some flyers that they handed out to all the Native Village members themselves and posted around the area. And then we also called the rental guy out at Eklutna Lake who rents out the kayaks so that he could inform people of the potentially hazardous conditions in the pond. So just trying to make sure that everyone was aware of what we were doing, also without trying to draw any kind of unnecessary attention. My husband is the one who would see danger, don't go here, and he'd be like, oh, I should go there. So we also didn't want to put out a more public statement in the fear that we would draw some unwanted attention, and so we thought this was the best path forward. Here's the flow release schedule, if you haven't seen it yet or were wondering. So we started flows on September 13th, and they started at 150 CFS. This was our highest flow. We intentionally started high and worked our way down because we know there was so much accumulated sediment in the river. Our in-stream flow study specifically actually requires that we have a much more stable channel. And so the intent was to start with a high flow release and let that flow go for a full week without collecting any data, specifically for channel stabilization purposes, because in order for our data collection to work, we needed to collect data with a stable channel. So the first week of 150 CFS was actually, we didn't have really anything going on in the river besides the flow releases themselves. And then the following Monday is when we actually started our data collection, and it took us a few days to collect all the data at our various transects. I think we had 30 transects throughout the river. And then on Friday, September 24th, we decreased flows to 75 CFS. For those who are wondering, we actually did not decrease it all at one time. We decreased it over a period of about 4 or 5 hours. This was done in this procedure was developed in coordination with our aquatics technical work group, and the intent was to prevent any kind of fish strandings downstream. So if we were to reduce the water flow too quickly, there's the potential that fish could strand up on the shoreline. So we followed the federal guidelines and developed a procedure, and I don't think we had any reports of fish stranding for any of our down rampings. But then, so those flows went on for 4 or 5 more days, and we decreased down to 25 CFS on Wednesday, September 29th. once again took more flow measurements and then decreased down to 0 CFS on October 6th. So that was the extent of the flows, September 13th to October 6th. The day after we started the flow releases, so on September 14th, we actually had a site visit with members from AWU and the native village of Eklutna, and it was also attended by Lee, our CEO with Chugach, and Tony, the CEO of Matanuska Electric. We also had some board members out there, so I think it was very productive. We basically took a few hours really to just talk through the project. Why we were doing things, what we were doing, what we were going to learn, what next steps were, and I think it was very educational for a lot of people. Aaron Leggett, president of the Native Village of Eklutna, was also out there with us and provided some great insight from the village's perspective, and so all around, I think it was very good. All right, so now we're to the fun video part of the presentation, and I'm just gonna let these go. I'll briefly describe what they are, and then we can just watch together, and we'll go on from there. But this is we had some drone footage of the flow releases at the dam, and so this first video is just showing the flows going from the lake into the river. Oop. And of course, it's having trouble downloading. Maybe we will have to come back to these.
I know the second one is short, Sam. I don't know if that would be a better one.
Oh, there it is, hopefully. Oh, well, apologies. We might not be able to show these to you. We might have to just send them to you so you can view them yourself. Let's see if the second one is any better. So this video is of water initially being released into the river. We're about a mile downstream.
Sam, for some reason you're cutting out.
There we go. Can you guys hear me now, Julie?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, so this video is the water flowing downstream initially into the river about a mile downstream near the first AWU access road bridge. And this is also where we happen to have our site visit with both AWU and NVE. It took the water about an hour to get here. So we, approximated that the water was traveling at about, a mile an hour. There's 12 miles of river, so if we extrapolate that, it took about 12 hours for the water to get from the initial flow release to get from the dam all the way down to the mouth of the river. And you can see people ask me, well, that doesn't look like 150 CFS. And that's largely due to the fact that, one, it takes a few minutes to open the gate all the way. So it's not instantaneous. But within about 5 minutes or so, we went from 0 to 150 CFS. Also, one of our hypotheses is that the groundwater in the upper river is probably very dry. And so in the initial releases, we probably, quote unquote, lost a lot of water into the groundwater as it was kind of filling up the groundwater reservoirs. And so this doesn't look like 150 CFS to people, and that's probably because it isn't. And it takes a little time for that water to make its way downstream. But by day 2, we had 150 CFS being released throughout the entire river. Here we go. And then other field work. So I know people are very interested in the flow releases, but we were doing a lot of other stuff out there. So on the left here, we have one of our guys doing some fish sampling up in the lake. And on the right is actually a picture of one of our field guys collecting data for the in-stream flow study during the 150 CFS flow. Here he's in the lower river, and you can see that the water clarity is pretty bad. And that's because of all the sediment that's being picked up, that was being picked up in the upper river. So for at least the first couple weeks of the flow releases, the water looked kind of like chocolate milk. Towards the end, it started to clear up a little bit as we got into the lower flows and not as much sediment was being transported downstream. And then, of course, after the flow releases ceased, especially in the lower river, the water clarity went back to normal. And then as far as next steps for our project, we are currently in the process of drafting our study reports for the year 1 studies. And then for year 2, we are starting some year 2 study planning. In order to facilitate that, we've established some new technical work groups for our new focus areas. This includes cultural resources, recreation, terrestrial. I have tail race there. This is referring to the tail race recreational fishery. But so I think we're going to end up combining that with recreation. So really, it'll just be 3 additional technical work groups. But these will all be in addition to the already established aquatics technical work group. And again, this is because we're starting to focus on new resource areas as part of our 2nd year of studies. And so in the meantime, we've been developing a proposed study program framework. Basically, what do we want to study? What are our goals? Where do we want to study it? And how do we think we're going to study it in year 2? We'll present that to the technical work groups and get their feedback in November. And then once we receive that feedback, we're going to start drafting our actual study plans for year 2. And then we'll distribute draft year 1 study reports and draft year 1 study plans to the technical work groups for review and comment in about the February timeframe is what we're shooting for. And I think that's it for my presentation, and we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you. First, I'll note that Mr. Weddleton arrived at 11:06 a.m. and was here for most of the presentation. And Mr. Dunbar, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that presentation, Owens. A couple of questions. First, you know, for those of us that aren't hydrologists, but also don't have encyclopedic knowledge of the Clutna facility, can you give us a sense of the scale of what 150 CFS is compared to, for example, what goes out the other side to the tail race? So how much is flowing through the pipe right now? Sure.
So when you say pipe, I assume you mean tunnel. But yeah. So the actually, if I go back to the video that wouldn't play, that's actually a very good way to describe this. So this is a Clutna Lake out here, right? And this is when we always refer to the pond. It's this little guy right here, and then we have our dam. But the intake for the project is actually kind of over here on the other side of the lake, about a mile away as the crow flies. And the way this project works is that there's a lake tap about 40 feet or so underwater, depending on the lake level at that time. And currently, under current operations, all water from the Clutna Lake is diverted into that intake and through the tunnel. Most of the water continues all the way out to the powerhouse. Some of it gets diverted for AWU public water supply. So on average, and again, this is just an average, we're diverting about 400 CFS at any given time through that tunnel combined. That's, you know, 400, well, maybe 400 to 450 combined. I think the tunnel's capacity is up to about 600 or 660. I don't know if we're not diverting 600 CFS every day of the year though. So if we were to average it out across the year, about 400 CFS is going through the intake and out the tunnel. So compare that to the 150 CFS that we were releasing down the river for our study flows this year, and it's about, you know, little over a third.
And my understanding is that AWU takes about 10% of the water that goes through that intake. Is that right?
Correct. And again, that's averages.
So on average, about 50 CFS goes to AWU.
I think that's accurate. 40, I think 40 to 50 CFS, something like that.
50 CFS. Okay. I mean, that's really interesting. When you think about scale, then that means at one point you were running 3 times as much water down that stream as AWU takes off of Eklutna for the entire city. And we know that that is, I don't know, I think about 80% of the water that Anchorage uses. They have some other sources, but it's, far and away the largest. Let's see here. We had some concerns about, debris or flooding downstream. Did any of those materialize? I mean, did it impact any property holders in ways we weren't expecting?
No, that's a great question, and I think I forgot to address that in my presentation. But part of our public safety plan was actually to install some staff gauges down by the New Glen Highway bridges and the railroad bridges, because there was continued concern that our flow releases would mobilize a lot of the accumulated sediment in the river, and that sediment could deposit in front of those bridges and cause some negative impacts. And so we looked at all the data available to us, and we sincerely did not think that was going to happen. However, I hesitate to ever give anyone a 100% guarantee. So kind of as a way to check ourselves, we installed the staff gauges down there, and the concept here is that after the initial flow release, let's say we put 150 CFS down the river. We go down there and we've basically put a giant ruler in the river. And once the water level has stabilized, the water level really shouldn't change, assuming that our flows don't change and there's no rainstorm or something like that. So if we go down there on a daily basis, which we did, and observe the water level during any one flow release, if we start to see the water level increase or we start to see the water level decrease for kind of unknown, unexplainable reasons, that is an indication, or would have been an indication, that there had been some kind of unanticipated deposition of sediment occurring, or maybe some unanticipated scour of deposition or of sediment occurring in those areas that might be cause for concern. So we established some warning limits and some action limits. Our warning limits were something between 1.5 to 2 feet of water level change, and our action limits were 3 to 4 feet of water level change. And this is consistent with what Eklutna Inc. Was doing as part of their sediment transport monitoring after the lower dam removal. When it was all said and done, after we collected all of our daily monitoring data, I think in total we saw less than, or maybe 0.2 of a foot of deposition at one of the bridges, and almost nothing happened at one of the other bridges. So way below our warning and action limits, and really nothing of any significant concern. So no, we did not see any negative impacts that we're aware of downstream. We do know that the geomorphology of the channel has changed in certain locations, especially what we like to call the flooded forest between the bridges and the Beaver Dam complex that's below the railroad bridge. We've started to see a lot of changes in the geomorphology down there, but nothing that's negatively impacted any infrastructure as far as we can tell.
Great. And one last quick question, Mr. Chair. So I know that, this is just the beginning of the various studies, and so you can't give me a set answer, but do you or anybody else have a very rough estimation of how many CFSs we need to sustain salmon in that river?
I know you want that answer, Forrest, and I honestly cannot give it to you yet. We have a bunch of very raw data right now. And now we need to develop a model, and that's going to take a series of months over the winter. So our winter is going to be devoted to not only developing our study reports and developing our study plans for next year, but a big part of it is going to be developing these models that we've been talking about in order to provide those numbers. So right now I have raw data that that has not been analyzed yet, and so I promise as soon as we start to know some of those numbers, we'll start sharing them with people, because we've been highly anticipating the results of that as well. But I really can't share anything at this time.
Great. Understood.
So-
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And I actually have two questions. The first one is in that output study that you're going to come up with from the data you've received, will you please add a table at least that compares the usage of the various entities, AWWU, Eklutna Power Plant, and the potential, whatever that river flow might be, in a uniform measure? In some places it's gallons per second, some places it's gallons per year, some places it's
Yes.
and so just help us understand this information in a uniform manner that we can all wrap our heads around. That would be really helpful, because I try to do the basic back of the envelope numbers and it looks like 8 billion gallons for AWWU. I can't quite grasp the number for the power plant, and about, if it's 150 cubic feet per second, it looks to be about 600 million gallons a year. It would be
Yes.
great to see that all demonstrated, and then we can really tie in. So then the second question, which is an actual question, not just a request, is, has anyone done any analysis on the possibility of reclaiming the water that gets poured into the tail race for water uses? It seems like that's a lot of water and a singular purpose flowing through a turbine to create energy. Past the turbine, they just let it cool down and flow into the river. Maybe there's an alternative use there that could be between the outflow and the river. And so I'm not sure, and that might be beyond the scope of your work, but.
Sure. Back in the day, back in the 1980s, when they were developing the what they called the Eklutna Water Project at that time, and it's basically the AWU infrastructure that's out there now. They did a very detailed alternatives analysis on one, where to get water for the city, and then once they kind of settled on Eklutna, how to get water from Eklutna for the city. And they looked at various different engineering ways to do it. I know that one of the things they looked at was exactly what you just said, taking water straight from the powerhouse tail race and piping that out to Anchorage, or backing up and over the mountain so they could go to the water treatment facility and then down to Anchorage. They looked at a few other configurations as well. And then what they ultimately settled on is what's out there now, which is a tunnel that tees off of the power tunnel. There's a second tunnel, right, that tees off of the power tunnel and actually loops around back to the river, daylights, becomes a buried pipeline, is buried next to the river, and in some places under the riverbed for 6 miles, and then pops out of the valley and goes to the water treatment plant. So that's what exists today. And I think at one point they did look at trying to reclaim water from the tail race, and it was ultimately determined that that wasn't the best option. So I don't know if anyone else has done any additional studies, but that's the one that I know of.
Yeah, thanks. And I don't know, when I think about Eklutna, in the end, it is a limited resource, although all the data shows us we have a very, very long life of that facility, no matter what the uses are. But it seems like we would be wise to be factoring in alternatives to when that water becomes more scarce.
Sure.
Thank you. Any other questions? And I'm not going to put you on the spot, Mark. I know you're here. Steve Padula, maybe Julie Esty, hands up.
Yes. Thanks, Chris. I just wanted to add to Sam's response. There is another very valuable use of that tail race water, and it's for the tail race fishery that exists there. So Fish and Game has developed a very substantial site that's adjacent to the tail race, which is probably an area from the powerhouse to the Knik Arm. We're talking several hundred yards in length. I mean, it's not that dramatic of an area in terms of length. But that's where they're probably, considered to be the best fishery currently in that part of the world, on the upper Knik Arm. And it's a very popular fishery. And so it generates a lot of public use. And as part of our studies, Sam referred earlier to a tail race technical work group that may be worked into our recreation work group. One of the things that we will make sure as part of our evaluation is if we change the way we manage water in this entire system, we need to also be looking at potential implications on that very popular fishery. So there is another important use of that water. Just wanted to make sure folks are aware of that.
Right, and I think for my part, and maybe I could speak for some other members, I'll go out on a ledge here and say it is the hope of this effort to restore Eklutna to be the #1 fishery on the Knik Arm, and that anyone that's manufactured as an element of an industrial function can be second or third if we can get the natural habitat restored in the tribe back to its position in the community of having its fish and being a host to all of these uses. And so it's an interesting counterbalancing question. If we're, using all these resources and there's an asset that is being used to keep an industrial fishery alive, maybe it's best used some way to keep a natural fishery alive. So, but that's more philosophy down the road.
Yes, and
Yeah,
thank you,
appreciate
Steve, for bringing that up. But yes, it's something we've definitely been thinking about. It'll be factored into our alternatives analysis. One of our main concerns here is that if we, or maybe not our main concern, but a concern is that if we start putting water down the Eklutna River to provide fish habitat there, and we know we don't want to impact or would try very hard not to impact water availability for public water supply, then that means that there would be less water going out to the power project and ultimately less water going through the tail race. And we suspect that might have a negative impact on the recreational fishery in the tail race, kind of in two ways. If there's less water going through the tail race, we know in during past maintenance events when maybe one turbine or two turbines have to be shut down or we're not generating as much, and the water becomes stagnant in the tail race, the fish don't come there. And angry fishermen will come and bang on the door of the powerhouse or call Fish and Game or call Chugach or call MEA or call the municipality or whoever and demand to have the generation turned back on so that fish come back to the tail race. And so by just reducing the amount of water through the tail race, that has the potential to have a negative impact. Also, any fish returning to the tail race would actually pass by Eklutna River first before they get to the tail race. So if the water that used to go into the tail race is now, or at least has been going to the tail race since 1955, now goes down Eklutna, there's the potential for those stocked kind of hatchery fish to stray up into the Eklutna River because they smell the water there first before they get to the tail race. And so that would reduce the amount of fish returning to the tail race, and it would also some people would view that as a potential negative impact to the natural populations of salmon that return to the Eklutna River already, mixing of hatchery salmon. So those are questions that we're going to try to answer. We don't want to be the ones who make the have the only say in what is and is not worth it and appropriate and things like that. And that's when we will start to really get a lot of other people's buy-in and opinions is during our alternatives analysis. So over the next year or so, again, with that, the kind of maybe fish stray study or tail race studies that we're going to be looking at to try and answer some of those questions, we want to develop the data so that we can have those kinds of discussions with affected stakeholders during the alternatives analysis and see, are we willing to have those impacts, or is the recreational fishery, super important to some people and any impact is bad? We want to be able to facilitate those discussions with good data.
Absolutely. The taking that we committed in the 50s, isn't going to make many people who live north of that river have any compassion because they want what they want and they want it now, but that's okay. These policy decisions we're contemplating are to restore harms that have been done for ages of humankind, not just today. So thank you. I'll get off of the soapbox. Any other questions from members? I'm not hearing any, so I think that I am really grateful for this report. I'm so excited that the water came down that river and that everybody's at the table and participating. Thank you for your hard work on this.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
It's nice to
Thanks.
see you all. Have a good day.
Thank
care.
you.
All right, so the next topic on our agenda for today is a discussion of impacts of proposed budget cuts. Is there someone from the administration who is interested in taking the lead on this conversation?
I can, this is Colby Hickle.
Thank you, Colby. You have the floor.
Thank you. I can speak a little bit. As you know, we've got the next budget presentation next week coming up, so I won't bore you with all the details, but I can hit some of the highlights for solid waste services. We are eliminating 3 positions. One is full-time, but solid waste services believe that they can absorb those duties among the other staff. But they will reach out until they can't fulfill those duties, and then if they need to hire someone, they will let us know. And the other 2 are vacant positions. One's full-time and one's part-time. So they just weren't really needed this time. We reduced the disposal budget by roughly $89,000 for the compost program, because it was essentially a giveaway to the community so that we can encourage them to use the organics program. So we're no longer going to do that. But then that also reduces the refuse collection by like say the vehicle cost of roughly $36,000 if you also combine the related revenues. But there is a bright side. We are expecting to implement that program or have it be reinstated by 2023. As you know, we're working on the central transfer station, so we're really just trying to tighten up our budget while we get used to paying for it.
So Colby, does that mean the pink trash containers are no longer going to be in service?
Correct.
Okay.
But it will be reinstated, so it's just a 1-year lag at this time. And again, if we can reevaluate it later in the year, we will do that. We also eliminated approximately $15,000 for an online app that the customers could use to obtain free disposal passes on their phone. But we are going to provide the free disposal passes in the annual property tax notices, so people will still be getting them that way. And then we've also provided in the past free bags for the citywide cleanup, and it was decided to eliminate those, and that was approximately $7,000. And then a big ticket item is we eliminated from the admin fund budget the cost of maintaining this public-facing tachometers for our website, and those gave us key performance indicators. We will continue tracking this data. However, the vendor themselves wasn't actually able to provide statistics on how many customers were accessing the information to determine if there was actually sufficient value to justify the cost. So we're going to track it ourselves, save the money, and then we can reevaluate that if the vendor actually can come back and give us some data that's newsworthy.
What's the use of the tachometers?
They gave us they help us it shows us how many customers are accessing our website actually. So if we're advertising on there, it'll show us how many people are clicking on the links and what links they're going to and what data they're accessing.
Okay, so it's not got to do with wind across the landfill and blowing gas into people's neighborhoods?
No. It's just a website thing.
Okay. Ms. Altel has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually have a couple of questions. I have a 50,000-foot view question regards to enterprise utility budgets overall. I know they were asked to find cost savings, and I still don't understand the rationale when they are often quite self-sustaining budgets and they pay for themselves. And then I guess I really am not understanding the solid waste services choice to put the compost program on hiatus. It was actually just picking up steam, no pun intended. I understand the role that the recycling center and the space at the central transfer station will play, but it seems short-sighted to lose the momentum of the program when it will be really geared up once the central transfer station is fully online to expand and take off from there. So maybe you could explain a little bit more clearly why this particular choice is being made. Is it anything beyond cost savings? Because the rate increases were implemented to cover the cost of the central transfer station and to bring the rates in alignment. So I'm just not getting both the overall rationale for cost savings being sought from enterprise and utility budgets, and then the specific tact to try to find cost savings within solid waste services.
Thank you for the question. As regards to the actual program, that was evaluated by Heidi and Dan, and they came up with that cost savings. So they would have the specific data on how popular it was. But I do know from my understanding that it was just a cost drain on the company or a financial strain. And that's why it was teed up to be eliminated. But again, there is plans to reinstate it in 2023.
Hey,
and if Dan's on, he can
Colby,
speak.
Colby, can I step in for a minute?
Absolutely.
Okay, hey, Meg, what we got going, we have
Before you speak, would you identify yourself for the record?
oh, this is Dan Zapay, Constant, Mr. Christopher.
Yep, good. Thank you.
Okay, Chris. Hey, anyway, what we're doing is we're not going to get rid of the program totally. Tetra Tech, who's doing our consulting on the new central transfer station, is also looking into the best way to promote our organics program. It's something we don't want to stop because it is a program that's going to keep growing. I think it's going to keep growing, and Susanna that works here also believes that. And so when we get the new transfer station up and running, we're going to have a bigger organics program at the old CTS with whoever gets the recycling program for this place, and we'll be able to grow it a lot at a substantial rate that we're going to need. It's if we look at the data right, it produced like 80 cubic yards all of last year of compost, and it approximately cost $160 a yard to produce. So we're looking at different avenues. We're waiting on this study to come back from Tetra Tech, and then we'll go from there. If it looks like something we should start up sooner before 2023, is something I'll have to ask the administration for.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a quick follow-up to that? I'm going to go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So I would, hope if, depending on the timing of the study from Tetra Tech, this would be something that perhaps might be best taken up at first quarter budget revisions. We can get the study before we undo the couple of years, 2 to 3 years of groundwork that was laid to get the composting program up and running. I think it's really important to not give up what's already been established with the program. So I really will look forward to that study. I guess I would prefer to wait before making any cuts to services in particular. I didn't hear a response, and I don't know if there is one or if it will be something that's explained when we meet next week about that 30 to 50,000 foot view about why cost savings or cuts were required or requested from enterprise and utilities budgets. Thanks.
Hi, Mr. Constant. This is Colby Hickle again. That will be explained more in detail at the budget meeting next week, but it was just a part of the policy to put forth to everyone to find budget cuts.
Okay, I'll look forward to that because that answer in and of itself I find deeply dissatisfying and really need more, especially when I talk to my constituents about why the service-based budgets that pay for themselves are being cut. Thank you.
Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, at the risk of getting too deep into a discussion that we're going to certainly pursue next week, and frankly also today, probably at Mr. Zapay's confirmation hearing. So a couple of details. When you refer to 3 positions being eliminated, is that across SWS, or is that just for the disposal utility? That's my first question. And then could you give me a little more detail about exactly what those positions were, whether they were vacant or filled, And the vacant ones, were they vacant because they'd long been vacant, or because they were, recently that person retired, for example, and we're not backfilling them?
Mr. Chair, this is Dan again. Can I speak?
Yes, please.
Anyway, the three positions that are eliminated. One was our one of our two sustainability, and he was actually the manager, Pierce. He resigned and moved on to a job, to another position with another company. So we didn't fill his position because we have another person that will be able to absorb his job. And then the other one is our code enforcement. We're putting that on hiatus, and we're going to try to utilize some other people on our staff and other city-owned businesses that we can make do with that.
And the third, that was two?
The third one, I think it was just they also resigned. I don't think there was nobody cut from that position. It was just a temporary engineer.
So yeah, I think that code enforcement position is going to be a subject of conversation over the next week or couple of weeks, given what they did. Another question I had, just you said something that piqued my interest, Dan. You said that you talked about the a private contractor at the new Tetra Tech was looking into promoting organics as a new transfer program, and that there would be a private company that would maybe take over the organics. Is that right? The operations of the organics, and is that how it works now? I guess I should ask.
No, Forrest, no, that's not. There's an RFP that's going to go out on the street, and we're hoping that West Rock Recycling over here on Rosewood Street will end up with the property here. It's been discussed with them, so hopefully they'll end up with it. And the organics program will still be managed by SWS. We're just going to have a corner of our current facility to put our organics at.
The facility on Dowling?
The facility on Dowling, we're hoping that they come out with a good RFP so we can slide them over here into the current CTS when we move over across the street.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, so Colby, there are like Merrifield, Port of Alaska, and AWWU also in the conversation about the potential of budget impacts of proposed cuts. So I imagine, as you said, the deep dive will be as we go through the budget work session, I think starting tomorrow and continuing through next week. But do you have any elements to add to this conversation about those other units of government?
Sure, this is Colby. Merrifield, there won't be any service impacts to them. Neither will be the Port of Alaska. And even though their small budget cuts for the port were some donations to luncheons, nothing else will be impacted by them. As far as AWU, it was a labor budget reduction for intern positions, but they won't have any impact on the people of Anchorage. That's one thing I can say. And those positions are some of those aren't currently filled. And if Mark's on here, he can go a little bit more in detail on those positions. But they implemented a voluntary temporary labor budget reduction in 2020 and 2021. And because they did well, they are going to continue those cost saving measures into 2022. Again, if they need to reevaluate that in 2022, they know to come to us and let us know and ask, and we will evaluate everything. And obviously, we do not want to have any service impacts to the people of Anchorage. But I can tell you there will be absolutely no cuts to our essential water and sewer services to our ratepayers and the community.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's hard to understand how that promise can be carried through, but we'll definitely be interested in that conversation. And so, not that I'm calling your word into question, just practical reality tells us that it takes money to run effective operations. So that said, I think if there are no other questions, we'll move to the final section of our audience, excuse me, our agenda.
Chris,
Yep,
Chris,
go ahead.
there's actually two of us in the queue.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're back in. Go ahead, Forrest.
Just very quickly, and this isn't even really a question. It's just to say, and I'm sure Ms. Hickel could guess this. You know, when I was going through the enterprise utility budget, the number of position cuts at AWU stood out. And so for Mr. Corstantino, or for you, when we go through this budget, I'd like a lot of detail on who exactly those 10 positions are. Because that was 5 from each of the units. So just
Right.
Once we get to it, I'd like a lot more detail. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Zalto?
Thank you. A question that can be addressed when we get to the AWU budget as well, but I'd really like to know kind of a revenue projection. I know revenues were down due to COVID and work from home on the commercial side, and see not only where has it been in 2021, projected for 2022 and beyond, as we continue to move through COVID, and are we planning based on, I guess, affected budgets, or are these cuts and these labor reductions more viewed as long-term? Thanks.
Mr. Cox, if I could, just because it is time sensitive, and I'll be brief, we'll be able to answer all those questions. This is Mark Corstantino from AU, by the way. We do have on the assembly, before the assembly, our proposed rate increases for 2022. So we are whole. All the positions that we are eliminating or defunding are mostly interim positions, 60% of them. The rest of them were vacancies that we've had in place because of as Meg alluded to, our COVID revenue shortfalls. Those are mostly restored, but we can manage those for now. Like Colby said, we will push back if need be during first quarter budget revisions. But we do have a rate increase proposed. It needs to go before the RCA. So the assembly timelines that those public hearings are in place for, and the next meeting in the fall, I want are really important to meet. And so that's, to me, is the more important thing that we need to make sure you guys are comfortable with and can address. Our boards unanimously approve those, but I just want to put a plug in there because that is time sensitive, and have to continue the conversation when the time is appropriate. Thank you.
All right, go ahead, Forrest.
Sorry, I just got this message from someone who is involved in the compost program, and they pointed out that we just received, I believe it was a $90,000 USDA community grant for compost projects. So Dan, can you speak to that? I mean, how does that work? Are we no longer going to access that grant, or can that grant move forward even if we are, ending or pausing the program?
That's something I'll have to check on for you, Forrest. I'll have to see if it's a program that's moving forward, or if it's something that we have to reapply for.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Now we'll move on to the final chapter of our agenda. That's audience participation. Anyone from the public like to be heard? We have time for one member. Anyone at all? Hearing none, I would entertain a motion. Yep, go ahead, Ms.
Adjourn, thank you. I just wanted to highlight, we didn't get to it today on the agenda, but we did distribute a stormwater utility commission resolution. I want to highlight that for members, and I'm hoping we can schedule it for next month's meeting to talk about it in more depth. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. The document has been circulated by the clerk to the members, and that for sure is going to be an item on next month's agenda. Okay, anyone else? Hearing, seeing none, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Thank you. We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.